Good morning, colleagues. I'm Isabel Oliver. I'm the Director General of Science and Research at the UK Health Security Agency. It is a real pleasure to welcome you to our first UKHSA Presents webinar series. Through this series, we hope to give our partners and colleagues an insight into our work on how we prevent, prepare for, and respond to infectious diseases and environmental hazards to keep all of our communities safe, and also to consider the opportunities for us to work together for greater public benefit. I would like to thank you all for taking your time out of the very busy jobs that you have to be here with us today. I would also like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the great work that you all do in protecting our nation's health and your support to the UK Health Security Agency. We could not deliver our important mission without your contributions. Today, we will be exploring our work on surveillance and preparedness for vector-borne diseases. As you know, sadly, in the context of climate and environmental change, we are already observing changes in the distribution of vectors, particularly mosquitoes and ticks, that can transmit serious infections to humans. In fact, vector-borne diseases account for more than 17% of all infectious disease burden globally, and they do cause more than 700,000 deaths a year in the world. These kinds of diseases include things like dengue, West Nile virus, Zika, malaria, and yellow fever. In UKHSA, we are working very hard to make sure that we are able to protect health effectively in the context of our changing climate. And we have established a Centre for Climate and Health Security to provide strong leadership in this area and to provide also a focus for working with partners to protect health. This morning, you will be hearing from Dr. Jolyon Medlock, who is our head of medical entomology here at the Centre for Climate and Health Security in UKHSA. He will give the main presentation on our work in this area. I'm delighted that we're also joined by Professor Leah Berrang-Ford, who is the head of the Centre for Climate and Health Security at UKHSA and leads our work on climate and health nationally and internationally. As you will see from today's session, tackling vector-borne disease is a cross-government effort, and I'm delighted to also welcome Dr. Helen Roberts from the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Helen is advisor for exotic disease control and co-chair of the Human Infections and Risk Surveillance Group, and will also participate in the question and answer session. The Q&A facility is now open, so please submit your questions and we will come to answer them at the end of the presentation. We have also asked for pre-submitted questions and we will come to a selection of them before going into the live Q&A. Please remember to vote up for questions that you would like to be answered the most, as we may not get a chance to get to all of them, but we'll do our best. And finally, I just would like to confirm that this webinar is recorded and the recording and the slides will be shared with you all. Before I hand over to Jolyon, and he's an excellent speaker, so you will see, I would like to share with you a short clip from a film our talented content team have made called Biting Back. The film shows the work that UKHSA's Centre for Climate and Health Security does and how we work to monitor the risk posed by vector-borne disease. So we look forward to your comments and your questions and answers. And without any further delay, please can we see the film? Thank you.
Hi, hello. I'm Professor Leah Berrang-Ford, and I head the Centre for Climate and Health Security at the UK Health Security Agency. The UKHSA established the Centre for Climate and Health Security to bring together existing expertise and build new expertise to enable the UK government, local governments, and partners to prepare for and build resilience in response to the threats to health that are posed by climate change. The work that we're doing on mosquito and tick surveillance is absolutely critical because we need to understand exactly where and when new species of mosquito, tick, or the pathogens that they carry are emerging in the UK, because that will allow us to deploy rapid response to minimize those populations and either prevent them from establishing in the UK or slow their spread. And that will have important implications for minimizing the risk of new and emergent pathogens within the UK.
We know that in Europe, West Nile virus and Mosquito cases are found each year, particularly in recent years. And it's likely that with climate change, that those viruses are going to be detected more often in the UK. So it's really important that our work conducts a surveillance for both the species that are going to be of most importance for vectoring those pathogens, but also we work with virologists to detect those pathogens within mosquitoes.
Ticks have actually been around for a really long time. There are actually some reports of them being found in amber back from when the dinosaurs were walking on the planet. This just goes to show that they're really good at evolving, and this is something that we really need to keep an eye on, particularly with future climate change scenarios. Ticks are not going to go away. They're going to evolve to the new situations and the changes that we make to our planet. And one of the challenges here is going to be scaling up this sort of regional response that we have to these incidents that might be arising. So the more people that engage in the surveillance schemes and the more people that engage with UKHSA on their local issues, feeding us information so that we can feed information back, the better.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Jolyon Medlock. I've been working on vector-borne disease for 25 years in both Europe and also globally. And for the last 20 years or so, I've been based at Porton Down and head of medical entomology. So I'd like to talk to you about some of the work we do in the Centre for Climate and Health Security, both for public health, but also in a One Health capacity in the work that we do with DEFRA and with research with the British universities. Next slide, please. So vector-borne diseases are defined as those infectious diseases transmitted by arthropod vectors. And when we're talking about arthropods, we're talking about ticks, mosquitoes, Culicordes midges, sandflies. From a public health perspective, mosquitoes and ticks are the primary vectors of concern for the UK. This slide shows quite a large change since I was at university 25 years ago. And that's led to sort of things like an incursion of exotic mosquitoes into southern Europe, an expansion to about 30 European countries. And now we have a return of what we used to consider tropical diseases like dengue. Actually, if we go back 100 years, there was dengue transmission in Greece, 1 million cases, but the mosquitoes were eradicated. Now we're seeing a return to that sort of climate with about 100 cases of locally acquired dengue in Europe in the last 2 years. We've also seen the re-emergence of malaria in parts of southeast Europe. We've seen the emergence of veterinary pathogens spread by Culicordes midges, Schmalenberg, a new virus that we didn't know anything about until 10, 15 years ago. West Nile virus emerged in North America from 1999 onwards, and we now see persistent transmission of this in Europe. And also other infections such as Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever virus have emerged in parts of Iberia and are a concern for the UK. For the UK ourselves, we've also seen human cases of babesiosis and the recent emergence of a Sutu virus. And there are a number of pathogens that are likely to spread and are spreading because of climate changes, such as tick-borne encephalitis virus in Scandinavia. Next slide, please. So as Isabel said at the start, 70% of infectious diseases globally are vector-borne, and most of the deaths associated with vector-borne disease are associated with things like malaria and dengue. But we actually see an increase in imported UK cases of malaria, more than 2,000 since 2004. The spread of invasive mosquitoes is one of the key concerns for Europe generally, and that's been reflected in what we anticipated would happen, which is the emergence of dengue, but also chikungunya and the occasional Zika virus case in Europe in recent years. The UK has about 20 species of tick, There's one particular species that is the primary concern, is a vector of Lyme disease and tick-borne encephalitis virus. And across Europe, we see about 65 to 85,000 cases of Lyme disease annually. Next slide, please. So what's UKHSA doing about it? We've heard already from Leah about the establishment of the Centre for Climate and Health Security. Vector-borne diseases are very acutely responsive to changes in climate. Mosquitoes will develop quicker at higher temperatures. The pathogens in those mosquitoes will also develop quicker at higher temperatures. And climate and weather also has an impact upon ticks, whether that be exotic ticks coming to the country on migratory birds, or pets being able to survive in a UK climate, or changing the seasonality of those ticks. So climate is a very key driver, but also environmental change, and I'll talk about that. Helen, who's with us from DEFRA, chairs the Human Animal Infections Risk Surveillance Group, and that's been going for 20 years. This is one of the sort of the leading groups set up. We're one of the vanguards really in the UK, and this is about One Health. This is recognising that many of these infections exist within a One Health capacity. They might have livestock or wildlife reservoirs, there are arthropods, there are climate and environmental impacts. We cannot work in isolation. It's very much a global effort across One Health. And the MESI team really are trying to sort of build the work that we're doing on medical entomology, not just in isolation ourselves, but also at a local level. We very much rely upon supporting local authorities, getting information from the public, supporting GPs and a number of different stakeholders, whether that be those that manage wetlands or work on urban green space. And that collaboration is also across government with colleagues in other government departments, but we also support the Crown dependencies and have some work in the overseas territories, particularly in relation to dengue prevention and hurricane response. So on the right there, you can see some of the risk assessments that we do on a regular basis that you can, if you search for HARES and in gov.uk, you can find more information about the latest concerns and impacts of these infectious diseases. Next slide, please. Last year, we published the health effects of climate change in the UK, state of the evidence so far. This climate change is having and will continue to have an impact on a number of different health threats. There is a particular chapter there on vector-borne disease, and that's heavily reliant upon development of weather and climate-based models to start to project what these risks are now and in the future. And these are really crucial in raising the profile of what issues might be on the horizon, putting those on the local agenda to support local authority planning, but also informing where we're likely to see the emergence of these diseases in the future to target our vector surveillance. And I'm going to spend most of the time talking about specifically vector surveillance. So that's looking for mosquitoes and ticks and pathogens in those vectors. Next slide, please. So let me start off with ticks. I already mentioned there are 20 species of tick. The sheep and deer tick is probably the tick that most people will come across. I live down in Wiltshire, Dorset, where ticks are very common. And if you go out during the spring and summer months, most of the woodlands will have at least some tick populations. There are other species that are quite specific to wildlife. So there may be some associated with bats, some associated with seabirds or certain livestock species. Lyme disease, we have about 1,500 lab confirmed cases of Lyme in England and Wales each year, but there are many more that are clinically diagnosed by GPs. And there are a number of sort of driving issues for the change in distribution of ticks and also an increase in Lyme disease cases. And one of those increases is that sort of interface between people and tick endemic habitats, such as urban green spaces and access to the countryside. Next slide, please. In 2005, we set up a tick surveillance scheme. We did this in collaboration with the Biological Records Centre that hold records on every species within the UK. We also do this for mosquitoes as well. And this enables us to collate information that already exists over the last 100 years on tick distributions and gives us a forum whereby the public, GPs, wildlife charities, vets can submit samples into us to our labs at Porton Down. So the main aims of this is really to promote surveillance and promote submissions of samples. This enables us to look at where ticks are, which species we have, and what the seasonality of those species. So when we're considering risk assessments of new and emerging infections, we need to know whether we have particular species in this country and where those hotspots are. This also tells us what's biting people and what are biting pets. Samples sent in from pet owners, from dogs and cats, act as useful sentinels for emerging issues that subsequently become an issue for public health. But we're often challenged with species that we don't have in the UK. So whether this be people bringing pets back into the country or people having travelled, whether it be Sri Lanka or Peru, there are a number of non-native species. And by looking at identifying these species, we can work out what potential infectious disease risks might be associated with them. We have an email address, tic@ukhsa.gov.uk. Please promote this. We're always willing to receive samples because it's crucial that we understand where these emergent risks are. Next slide, please. So what do we do with this information? This is a map on the left-hand side showing the current reports of Ixodes risnus ticks, so the vector of Lyme and tick-borne encephalitis virus. The red dots show where we've recently received records, but we haven't received them in the last 12 to 15 years. So this shows an emerging risks. This suggests that actually ticks are potentially expanding in distribution. And we know that that's probably related to the expansion of deer populations. Looking at some of the data, we can see there's an expansion distribution of about 3% year on year. And most of the risk, particularly for England, is in the southern counties, but also parts of Yorkshire, Cumberland and Westmoreland, and lower risk in the Midlands, but that's likely to change. And the key thing there is ensuring that those people that aren't aware of ticks are made more aware of ticks in the future. We can use this information also to develop habitat suitability models and starting to make assessments of climatic changes. Next slide, please. It's very well collecting data, but how do we refer that data back to the public? So anybody who submits information about a tick to our scheme immediately gets information about Lyme disease and Lyme awareness. And there are many anecdotes and concerns about ticks and Lyme disease that people have. That may well be helping people manage ticks in their gardens or referring them to our rare and imported pathogen lab for advice on Lyme disease. We work with our behavioural science colleagues to ensure that we're giving the right information in the right way to the right people. And we're also supporting our local authority public health teams by identifying not only where Lyme disease cases are and the incidence of Lyme disease is high, and that information is available through fingertips from our epidemiologists, but also translating our tick surveillance data into tick bite incidence information and highlighting those key local authorities that we can contact and inform that particular areas of the country are seeing higher rates of Lyme tick bites, tick bites in humans. Next slide, please. Where the ticks are is one thing, but whether those ticks have infections is something else. We've been working on a project for 10 years now with our colleagues in the national parks, the national landscapes and forestry England to develop a snapshot understanding of infection rates. And this is our baseline really for understanding how we can start to overcome some of the issues to do with Lyme disease and other diseases. So we have ticks sent into our labs from wildlife rangers from across the country, and we're expanding this at the moment with our colleagues in Forestry England. We test those ticks in the lab using PCR to look at infection rates, and then we sequence them to see what type of Borrelia. There are different types of bacteria that cause Lyme disease, and each of them have a slightly different clinical presentation. But Borrelia is very much a disease, a pathogen that occurs within wildlife, transmitted by ticks to humans. Humans are dead-end hosts, so the cycle of the variation from one year to the next is very much dependent upon the weather, the climate, the impact that has on tree mass production, the impact that tree mass production has on small mammal populations, and other factors such as the number of deer or game birds or other wildlife within the countryside. And only when we can actually understand what's driving transmission cycles can we begin to start implementing environmental solutions to minimising Lyme. Next slide, please. Some research that we were able to do recently in the Health Protection Research Unit was to try and detect, or see if we could detect for the first time, the presence of tick-borne encephalitis virus. We were very aware of the emergence of this virus in the Netherlands and expansion to more northerly climes. Where there are foci of this virus aren't necessarily everywhere where there are ticks. It's very weather dependent. There needs to be a particular certain local climate that supports a transmission between ticks and small mammals. So we work with virologists here at Porton and academic groups at Liverpool and wildlife experts to collect blood from deer from across the country and test those serologically to see whether deer had been exposed to flavivirus. And then collecting ticks from those seropositive deer, we can then start to try and find those viruses both within ticks on animals and also within the wider countryside. And this led to the recognition that actually there were a number of small foci where tick-borne encephalitis virus was actually present. And over the last few years, we now have sort of 5 probable, possible, confirmed cases of tick-borne encephalitis virus. Using this information, we can update our risk assessments and ensure that our health protection teams, GPs and the public are aware of this new and emerging threat. And we'll continue to monitor this in coming years. Next slide, please. Going back to environmental change, and this is something that I talk to Helen about on a regular basis because it cuts across both public health and also animal health and the environment, is understanding how the landscape's going to change in the UK. There's a recognition that we want to increase biodiversity and increase woodland cover, and there are many rewilding projects currently in place. So we have to have the evidence in advance to ensure that we can continue to change the environment without exacerbating the impact that might have on emerging tick-borne disease. And we have similar work, which I'll mention a little bit later, for wetlands and mosquitoes. So there's a number of research projects that I'll mention towards the end with academic colleagues, where we're working with wildlife experts to understand these driving forces. What is the impact of deer expansion on tick populations? Do game birds play a role in sustaining ticks or enhancing Borrelia infection rates? How can we change the way we manage woodland, whether that be managing people's exposure within woodland ecosystems, and what about connectivity and tree planting? And one of the key factors changing the distribution of ticks in the UK, or the occurrence of ticks, is the controls on pets that are coming back into the UK. Pets come into the UK often with ticks, and some of these potentially could establish in the future, particularly with climate change. And we're working with colleagues across DEFRA to ensure that we've got the right risk assessments in place. Next slide, please. Other examples of One Health strategies that we do with our colleagues at Animal Plant Health Agency is that through our tick surveillance scheme, we also get a number of other species. The Dermacentor reticulatus is a tick associated with cattle. Haemophilus punctata is a tick associated with sheep, and these have certain veterinary issues, but we're also looking for public health issues as well. Ticks can also come in on migratory birds each year, and these have happened forever, but in the past perhaps the climate's been too cold for these ticks to survive in the UK. But what we're seeing now in very hot years, heatwave years, is these ticks are actually able to complete their molt and then subsequently are found on animals or on people in the UK. So we need to be sure that we're aware of these risks and we can manage and mitigate those risks for the future. High loma ticks are one of those examples, which are a vector of Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever virus, which is a viral hemorrhagic fever virus in Southern Europe and Africa. Next slide, please. Moving on to mosquitoes. There's quite a lot has changed in Europe in recent years, and we're currently seeing a global epidemic of dengue. Looking at some of our projections for the future, we think that epidemic dengue risk in London could occur as early as 2060, and that's really been brought home recently by 3 cases of dengue virus in humans that haven't travelled in Paris last year. Climate is crucial in supporting both the mosquito in temperate climates and also the virus transmission within the mosquito. So when you travel off to the tropics and come back with dengue or chikungunya or Zika, you're potentially a source of infection if we have the mosquitoes occurring locally and if the climate is suitable for that development of the virus within the mosquito. We've also seen chikungunya transmission in parts of Europe, and we might expect to see some locally acquired cases of this in the latter half of the century. But the crucial thing here is the establishment of Aedes albopictus, the tiger mosquito. That's probably one of the most significant vector-borne disease risks that we're likely to see emerging in the UK from climate change. We're monitoring this situation. I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the surveillance work and how important it is that we work with local authorities. We've so far detected Aedes albopictus or Aedes aegypti, the yellow fever mosquito, on 8 occasions since 2016. And we expect to see many more in the future, particularly as they expand. They're now in about 60% of the départements in France. Next slide, please. It's not possible to look absolutely everywhere for invasive mosquitoes on our own. We have to do this through a number of different ways. So we have a citizen science project that we've run for 15 years where we encourage the public to send us images or specimens into our labs if they've been bitten by mosquitoes. We also reach out to the local authorities, primarily where there are points of entry, so motorway service stations, inland border facilities, seaports and airports. But now more recently in some of the urban centres where our climate modelling suggests that these mosquitoes could establish. We come up with a system developed through some of the contingency planning that we've done with colleagues across government to identify a smart and efficient way of running over thousands of ovitraps that can pick up eggs. So a mosquito might come in within vehicles, having fed on the individual in the vehicle, and then look for somewhere to lay their eggs in containers. These are historically tree hole mosquitoes of Asia that have adapted to urbanization. They can lay eggs in any container that collects rainwater. We've also developed advice and information to the public, and we have a lot of involvement in supporting local authorities in following the detection of these mosquito eggs. So we have incidents set up with our health protection teams, and we're on site within 24 hours to work with a local authority to minimise that risk. If we can keep our points of entry and our vehicular hubs and service stations free of mosquitoes, we can hopefully delay the dissemination of these mosquitoes across the country. There are a number of research projects looking at smart ways in which we can harness Wolbachia and sterile insect techniques to control these mosquitoes, and we're learning very much from what's going on in France as well. Next slide, please. This just shows the distribution, and over the 22 years I've been working on this mosquito, that has changed quite significantly in distribution now. Yellow shows where we've had introductions, but they haven't established. Red shows the areas of Europe where this mosquito is established. On the right hand side shows the current suitable climates, and we have climate change models that you can read in the Health Effects of Climate Change report that show what the projections are for the future. So we should all be concerned about this mosquito, and I encourage you all, particularly those in local authority, to join in supporting us with surveillance and ensuring that we can minimise the establishment of this mosquito now before it becomes more of an economic and health burden in the future. Next slide, please. There are some key documents available on the website. We have a national contingency plan for invasive mosquitoes in relation to detection incursions, and we're currently working across government to update this in light of recent events. There's a handbook available, particularly on the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health website, and the management of invasive species of mosquitoes. This gives information to environmental health officers about key aspects of biology, ecology of the mosquito, how to control them. And we have a number of leaflets in readiness for when this mosquito becomes established. Next slide, please. I want to alert you to one recent emerging disease that we've had, particularly from a One Health perspective, and I think this is a really good model for the future. This is work that we've been doing with colleagues from the Animal and Plant Health Agency, the Institute of Zoology, and the British Trust for Ornithology. So we've got interest from public health, animal health, wildlife health, and also biodiversity. During the pandemic, a few blackbirds, dead blackbirds, were found and were tested and found to be positive for a SOO2 virus. The SOO2 virus is a mosquito-borne flavivirus that can cause high mortality rates in certain bird species. There's very little evidence to suggest it causes much human disease in human disease, but it is a potential zoonosis, so it does concern us. We've conducted over the last 3 or 4 years extensive mosquito surveillance to understand which vectors we have. These mosquito species, we have 36 species. We want to know about their seasonality. We want to know which ones are biting people, and also the habitats and the wetland types that these exist within. We ensure that these mosquitoes are collected in the field, and we can't do this without the work that we do with our wetland ecologists, both within environmental organisations and in Natural England. And these mosquitoes are then tested in the labs at Weybridge for a range of different arboviruses. We're backing this information up with the work that the Dead Birds Garden Bird Health Survey. So dead birds are sent into the labs at London Zoo and on to Weybridge for testing. And we're also working with British Trust for Ornithology. They collect a huge amount of data on the abundance of birds. And what they've seen actually is a decline in the number of blackbirds in London and now the southeast of England over the last 3 or 4 years. And it's very likely that SOO2 is playing one key role in this. Of course, there might be others as well. And my colleagues, clinical colleagues, are also conducting human seroprevalence studies in people who are working closely with these birds to see whether they've been exposed. So that's a nice example, and there's a number of other emerging mosquito-borne diseases such as West Nile virus that we're employing similar strategies for. Next slide, please. One other aspect is ensuring that those people who are responsible for managing the countryside, particularly in relation to mosquitoes for wetlands, have up-to-date information on what mosquitoes mean for those wetlands. Where do those mosquitoes live? What species are they? Which ones are biting? How could they potentially create, manage and expand wetlands in the future? Wetland creation is a really important part of how we adapt to climate change. We need to ensure that we're managing coastal and inland flooding issues. And one of those things is by developing new wetlands. But we don't want to do that whilst also creating a future mosquito-borne disease risk. So the last couple of years, we've been working with colleagues of the University of Greenwich and a number of other universities to develop guidance documents for wetland managers. So you can search for this online, the Wetland Mosquito Survey Handbook, 130 pages packed of photographs and information about British mosquitoes. And this enables really as an ecological handbook for wetland managers to assess the suitability of their wetlands for mosquitoes and to sort of minimise those risks, minimise nuisance biting. We're also looking to do something similar in relation to urban ticks and Lyme disease through some research with a number of universities, and we've conducted research to identify where those hotspots are, and that will follow soon. Next slide, please. One of the key aspects, particularly in the summer months for my team, is to respond to incidents. I've already mentioned the Sutu virus. Each summer we're always on tenterhooks for detecting eggs in our ovitraps or getting photographs coming in through our email system from members of the public that turn out to be Asian tiger mosquito. We then implement the contingency plans that are already in place, working with the health protection teams. Tick-borne encephalitis virus is a new issue. We take the lead from our clinical colleagues that are diagnosing viral encephalitis virus and detecting tick-borne encephalitis virus to see whether there are new foci within the country. And we're continually testing mosquitoes for the emergence of new arboviruses. But also occasionally we have things like cryptic malaria cases, people acquiring malaria that haven't travelled. And to ensure whether there is any local transmission, we know that the climate in the UK is suitable for malaria transmission. We used to have malaria outbreaks in the past. We had incidents of malaria following return of infected servicemen following the war. But often actually these, and in all cases, these malaria cases are due to airport, suitcase or transfusion transmitted malaria. So these are people coming back from the tropics with mosquitoes in their bags, or they're perhaps acquiring bites at airports. I mean, these are quite unusual, perhaps more common in other countries, but it's something that we tend to work with. Next slide, please. And I want to finish my presentation talking about the research work that we do. A key aspect of UKHSA is how we collaborate and work with our partners in the UK universities. We've been very grateful to the UK Research and Innovation Fund, who put up money, and DEFRA, who put up money, £6.5 million for research in vector-borne related issues for the UK. And our team are currently involved in 6 of these projects. And the work we're doing on the Sutu virus and West Nile virus is the Vector-borne radar project with the Animal Plant Health Agency. We've been working with Glasgow University and the Scottish Government to set up mosquito surveillance and vector competence testing in the labs at Glasgow. We're working with our Animal Plant Health Agency to understand farm-associated risks through the OPTIC project and the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology in the University of Liverpool. So this is actually going on farms, working with farmers, understanding the challenges they have in parts of Wales and England in relation to tick-borne infections, and ensuring that we can meet biodiversity strategies without necessarily exacerbating tick-borne disease risks. We now have some of the best data on some of our Culex mosquitoes, which are the potential vectors of West Nile virus that we've ever had. And this has involved work with Liverpool University to map mosquitoes right across the country, looking at sort of the molecular analysis of these mosquitoes and working out whether they could potentially transmit virus and identifying hotspots. And working with our genomics colleagues. I've never thrown any ticks out in all the time we've been working at Porton, so I have several freezers full of ticks that have been sent in to us in the past, and we're now using all of these samples, archive samples, to do genomics to see whether we can detect new emerging infections. So I hope you found that useful. I will stop my presentation there. There's just one more snippet from the video that we'll now move to in relation to the work that we're doing in the Centre for Climate and Health Security.
From an entomology perspective, the policy decisions we make today will have implications for vector-borne disease risk in the future. This includes, for example, the ways in which we decide to green the UK under decarbonisation. So many decarbonisation strategies involve nature-based solutions or greening different landscapes. And it's important that we do so in a way that doesn't create new habitat for vector-borne disease and generate new health risks. Secondly, we need to decide what our approach will be to controlling vector-borne disease and mosquito risk in the UK. It is possible to prevent or dramatically slow the invasion of mosquitoes and new pathogens, but that takes huge investment in surveillance, in mosquito chasing, in mosquito testing. So the decisions we make today will affect the extent to which new diseases become established in the country in the future.
One of the important aspects for the future is to raise awareness amongst all of us of the threats posed by vector-borne disease. I've worked in the field for 25 years, been exposed to lots of ticks and lots of tick habitats, but I'm aware of how I can minimise my risks associated with tick-borne infections. So it's all about passing on that information to the public and also our future generations.
Climate change cannot be reversed. We have to learn to live with it. And importantly, to minimize the level of warming, because that will minimize our risk, and then to adapt to the risks that we've already committed to through past emissions. The last generation committed us to a level of impacts that we cannot avoid. What we can do is avoid and minimize and influence the impacts of the next generation.
Well, thank you very much. That was absolutely excellent. And Jolyon, your presentation was fascinating, as always. And I'm sure all of our colleagues online could see the importance of the work. And I know you are ready to go into the field after this webinar. Your explanation was excellent in terms of describing our surveillance, the changes that we are observing, and also the drivers for those changes and what we are doing to respond to them. Colleagues, we haven't had many questions from you online, so please submit questions if you want our excellent panel to expand on any of these issues. We did have a few questions submitted before the webinar, so I'm going to start with those. And Leah and Helen, we've got a colleague who wanted to know what are your biggest concerns about climate change in relation to vector-borne disease. I think Jolyon has highlighted a number of areas, but maybe if you could think particularly what you are most worried about, and Helen, very happy for you to bring obviously the animal health context into this, but also what we are doing as part of government in response of these changes and these concerns. So Helen, I'm going to go first to you, if that's okay.
Yep, certainly. And good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. So I think the biggest concerns that we have are not only the livestock diseases, but also those zoonotic diseases. We have a lot of movement of animals from around the world, and particularly Europe, but also we shouldn't forget that wild animals can also carry these vectors with them, particularly the ticks. So the expansion of tick-borne diseases across Europe, Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever, it's called Crimean Congo because that's where it started, but actually it's present in Spain. There's been a potential finding in France, and again that's moving north, and the expansion of those tick vectors, and then all of the mosquito-borne diseases. This country is suitable and has been in the past, where we used to have endemic malaria in parts of southeast England. We shouldn't forget that. We could go back to that situation if we don't manage the environment correctly. And And midges, we shouldn't forget those. I mean, with midge-borne diseases, okay, mostly they're about animal health, but we also have Oropouche virus, which has been kicking off in South and Central America, which is a human disease carried by midges. At the moment, we're dealing with blue tongue, which is potentially going to be quite a big outbreak across southeast England, and the latest case up in Yorkshire. So we've still got quite a few months left of vector season, and climate change extends the vector season for us. That's our biggest concern. Where we thought in the past you'll have a nice cold winter and it'll get rid of everything. Maybe not in the future. We're looking at a much shortened vector-free period, and that is concerning if you've got animals that are still harbouring virus for several months. And then you've got the pets, the pet travel. Lots of people take their pets around, and also horses, which some people would consider to be pets, can have ticks on them, can bring them in, and making sure that people are aware of checking their animals for ticks. We're just about to do a paper in the Horse and Hound, for example, to remind people about looking for ticks on their horses and to send them in to the tick surveillance scheme as much as possible so that we can get a better picture of what's out there. So from our side, it's really about that joined up approach across the environmental health and public health and animal health, so that we all speak to each other regularly about what we're doing and how we can help each other as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's really helpful, Helen. I was in Spain this summer, and the impact of the detections of cases of Crimea Congo hemorrhagic fever over there on communities was very, very extensive. And of course, we saw all of the efforts that colleagues in France had to implement, including in the context of the Olympic Games. So, Leah, how about you from a UK health security perspective? What are you most concerned about, and how are you working with colleagues across government to address those issues?
Thanks, Isabel. I would say that I'm most concerned that we don't wait too long to respond to these changing risks, because it's much, much harder and much more expensive and resource intensive to try to suppress and control vectors once they've arrived in the UK. It's much more cost effective to prepare in advance and to try and prevent Aedes albopictus, for example, from coming into the UK, and sort of intensively trying to fend that off as long as possible. So if we wait until this mosquito is sort of established and spread throughout the country, then we've really waited too long, and it's going to be a much tougher job. But like I mentioned in the video, that requires quite a bit of work now. It requires taking action for a risk that's hard to see necessarily on the ground locally at the moment. I know when my children were born, and in their first years, when I was living in Montreal, all houses are built with screens on the doors and windows. And when we would go outside for walks or for hikes, we would always pull up our socks. We would wear hats, because they're both high nuisance mosquitoes that could carry things like West Nile virus, and because we knew we were in a heavy tick and Lyme disease area. So there's really this sort of culture in regions that might have vector-borne diseases and ticks in mosquitoes that builds within populations. And in the UK, what we're probably looking at is this transition of our culture and our relationship to flying insects that we want to evolve and we want to transition. And actually, the more we can do that proactively, the more we can protect health and reduce the costs of doing so. In terms of what we're doing, sorry, Isabel. In terms of what we're doing, I think Jolyon has spoken a lot about that work. and really providing as much evidence and as much information on the risks and how they're evolving and what types of responses would be most suitable.
Thank you. So that, yes, you're right. Jolyon explained a lot how we're working with partners on this. But one of our colleagues online has put a question about to what degree all these efforts are part of a coordinated national strategy, and whether, there is, presumably our colleague is suggesting whether there is more work that needs to be done to sort of think about this as a sort of, joint national effort. Any thoughts from any of you? Leah, first of all, any thoughts about the sort of national coordination of this?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to speak to that. Yeah, happy to respond. We're really growing rapidly and working towards exactly that level of coordination. So to give you an example, we have been participating, as Jolyon said, in leading surveillance on ticks and mosquitoes nationally. And so at the moment, we do interact with and share with high-risk areas some of that information on mapping where high-risk areas, et cetera. But what we're moving towards is providing more systematic, public-facing digital services to be able to view where the high-risk areas are, what the risk factors are, how there's changing presence, incidence, and risk of particular vector-borne diseases and vectors. So making that easily accessible through digital services, as well as increasing the number of toolkits and guidance documents that are available, as well as training to help skill up and support local authorities and partners in being able to both understand what the risks are, as well as identify what some of those effective strategies might be. We're also starting to work with particular regions and local authorities, for example, who might want to undertake greening activities. So many areas are dealing with obviously a lot of priorities, and in some cases where greening of landscapes is considered as a decarbonization strategy, ensuring that we don't create new risks. So greening landscapes, there's a lot of evidence that there are quite a few health benefits of doing so. One of the potential trade-offs or risks is actually vector-borne disease. So also supporting some of the work and communities really taking leadership in greening initiatives to understand what it is that you can do to make greening as healthy as possible, or as health promoting as possible, including consideration of whether those habitats might be suitable for mosquitoes. And I don't know, Jolyon, I wonder if you want to jump in and provide some examples of some of those collaborations that we've been having, particularly on greening.
Yep. We have a number of research projects working with colleagues at Centre for Ecology and Hydrology and some of the universities, where actually got quite a lot of stakeholder engagement across the environment sector. So we're working with those people responsible for managing forests, Forestry England colleagues, those people involved with management of deer populations. And this is really about trying to identify environmental solutions. So where we might in public health come up with some ideas about how we potentially manage tick populations, it's what's actually feasible within the natural landscape, and co-develop some of these strategies. I think this is a really important project, because this is working with people who day to day are out in forests and understand what some of those risks are. And that's also the same with working with colleagues that are responsible for urban green space management. Wildlife corridors will mean increase in wildlife corridors will mean an increase in wildlife populations, which might lead to an increase in tick populations. But there's ways in which we can manage that. Ticks are acutely responsive to changes in microclimate. And if we can manage some of those urban green spaces to make them less suitable for ticks, or to provide areas where there's space for nature, but also space for people without that exposure. I put in the chat something about mosquito. Someone was asking me about wetlands. the key message that came out of the United States before we started this research, and I agree with it now, is healthy wetlands equals less mosquitoes. If you've got a healthy wetland where you've got lots of permanent water that has lots of invertebrate predators, bats, birds, all sorts of diving beetles, dragonflies, spiders, there are so many opportunities for mosquitoes to be preyed upon, and that supports a wealth of other biodiversity. So wetlands aren't a bad thing. They're a hugely important thing, hugely important for biodiversity. But ensuring that those wetlands don't dry out and aren't affected by drought. Mosquitoes respond to a boom bust. If it dries out and then re-wets, the first thing that will colonize will be mosquitoes. So healthy wetlands are really important.
That's really clear, Jolyon, and I think one of the issues here is making sure that we continue to develop that evidence base of what's most effective. I'm going to come back to a series of questions around local authority role and how we can work with local authorities. But before I do that, Helen, presumably DEFRA are also obviously very interested in issues around sustainable farming and rewilding. I don't know if there's anything that you want to add briefly before we touch on the questions around how we work with local authorities.
Yes, thank you. It's a really good point. We are certainly looking at doing a large workshop at some point in end of this month towards October, looking at bringing together all the people who are very keen to do sustainable farming projects and our National Environment Plan and so on, and thinking of the unexpected consequences of it, because I think we don't talk enough together about it, and bring in the rewilding and the biodiversity projects and think properly about, does this increase the risk for some of these vector-borne diseases, or does it manage the landscape better and prevent this because you are increasing that biodiversity? It's a trade-off, and we don't necessarily have the right answer. So we want to make sure we bring everybody in together and you have a really good piece of work that can look at those different areas. The Futures team at DEFRA has a process for doing it, but also the Cosmic Bazaar is another area that we look at to think of suitable questions for a community of experts to speak to, and also the World Organization for Animal Health have a futures team looking at foresighting for these events. Yeah. So it's really important to have a long-term vision for this. Thank you.
Absolutely, thank you very much. So I think both Leah and Jolyon have mentioned a little bit how UKHSA is working with local authorities. Our local authority partners are absolutely critical to our work in this area. In fact, I've personally had some really good conversations with colleagues in the Association of Directors of Environment, Transport and Place, so the Directors of Place and the Association of Directors of Public Health, and this is an area where we want to absolutely strengthen our collaboration with local government colleagues. I was wondering, Jolyon and Leah, if you want to expand a little bit more on the role of local authorities and how you think they can prepare for the changes that we are already observing. Helen, you may also want to add, obviously, from your perspective. We've got a similar question as well from our colleagues at the Royal College of Emergency Medicine, and I know somebody was also interested about the role of ICSs. So I just wonder if you might just want to generally think a little bit about how we work as a system to tackle these complex challenges. Jolyon, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, I was just going to identify a couple of things that we've had good experience of working with local authorities and that we're keen to push out. One is through sort of training environmental health officers and bringing them up to date with the latest risks. There's no doubt that these risks are changing at a rapid pace, particularly in relation to invasive mosquitoes. Through our health protection teams, we run sort of training webinars where we encourage local authority pest control officers to join in and hear about the latest work that we're doing collectively, and some case studies of some incidents that we've had to deal with. So we really do, if you do work in local authorities and pest control, we really do encourage you to either contact us directly at mosquito@ukhsa.gov.uk or through the health protection team, so we can ensure that we're providing that sort of training. And then, of course, we're trying to encourage local authorities to support us in expanding that surveillance system. The other aspect is in relation to public health teams and raising awareness. I illustrated some data that we had that showed a change in distribution of ticks. Now, those people who have, members of the public that have lived in tick endemic habitats perhaps all their life, they're aware of what those key strategies are. How, the key thing is you need to know when you're entering a tick habitat, what the ticks look like, and how you can minimize your risk both when you're in those tick habitats and then when you return, ensure that you're removing ticks rapidly. So I think public health messaging, taking up some of the work on the tick toolkit that is been mentioned in the chat, are two key aspects.
And thanks a lot. And Leah, we established a Centre for Climate and Health Security to provide that focus for working with partners and to make sure that we have got the evidence base on what works in this area. Do you want to comment a little bit more on this?
Yes, absolutely. In addition to the engagement that Jolyon's talking about, one of the things that the Centre is designed to do is to step back and really look at some of the long-term scenario planning that we might think about. So begin to think, what could we potentially anticipate? How are different vector species and pathogens moving towards the UK from outside of the UK? What are the emerging global risks that we should be thinking about in the UK? And how can we do a bit sort of long-term thinking about what to anticipate and prepare? So that will include speaking with and engaging with pandemic preparedness to see if there are any risks unlikely to be high on our lists to have a vector-borne disease, a vector-borne pandemic, but certainly working closely with partner nations to find out what their challenges are and to coordinate surveillance. There was one of the questions in the chat about how we work with other nations. So there's quite a bit of close work, I know, Jolyon, particularly with European colleagues, but colleagues internationally, to share insight on what some of those risks are and whether the implications of that might be looking at our diagnostics. Do we want to have sort of increased diagnostics, awareness in that space, or treatment? So that's one piece of engagement in terms of globally. And then the Centre, we also work with climate modelers to really understand how it is that these diseases are sensitive. In some cases, both the insect vector and the pathogen are climate sensitive. And so we can think about on different trajectories of warming, what that means for the potential spread of those vectors. And we can also begin to think about modeling. So if we model changing drivers of habitat, be that green space or animals, how that might affect risk. So some of that research and long-term thinking are the pieces that we're also trying to bring expertise in.
Thanks, Leah. Helen, anything else you wanted to add about work with local authority or other system partners, of course?
Yes, thanks. So the local authorities, from our perspective, are our enforcement body as well. So they would definitely be involved if we had a disease outbreak that involved vectors. And we use a lot of modelling to consider the spread. So we're doing that a lot with blue tongue at the moment, and the midge distribution, temperature and climate and so on. But also we work a lot with both the private vets and our own veterinary investigators. We have a series of veterinary investigation centres around the country who are all aware of the tick surveillance scheme, so they know if they get any carcasses in or any samples in, they know to send them through to that. We have a Centre for Extended Management of Livestock as well, who are involved in that. So they're looking at some of these big deer populations, but also the when you've got sheep farms that are over extended areas as opposed to livestock in quite small parts. Again, really involved with making sure they collect samples, send them in. And the pet owners as well, I think they are absolutely very aware of having ticks on their animals, but we still want to encourage them to send them in because we just don't necessarily get that full picture of the different species that are on those pets. They come in, particularly if they've been travelling somewhere. And certainly from my point of view, if I see a tick on one of my animals, I just want to get rid of it as quickly as possible and think, no, stop, I need to send it off. I need to make sure that it goes to the tick surveillance scheme, because I can't possibly tell you what sort of tick it is. I need an expert to do that for me. So keeping that message alive and making sure that plenty of people know about it, and all of the animal keepers in the country, because if there are zoonotic diseases, it's not going to be pleasant for them either.
Thank you, Helen. That's fantastic. So I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of your questions, but I would just say that this is an important and challenge for all of us jointly. As Leah said, there is much that we can do to protect our communities from vector-borne disease in the context of a changing climate. We focus today on surveillance of vectors rather than surveillance of human cases of vector-borne disease. But of course, the role of the NHS, including accident and emergency departments in our human surveillance, is also critical. We are working in partnership with you, but we do want to do more. So any suggestions that you have, please also get in touch or put them in the chat. I would like to also thank very much our Jolyon, our presenter, and our panel, Helen and Leah, for their excellent insights in this area, and to all of you for joining today. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is going to be a series of webinars and events. And I'd just like to give you a little bit of advance warning that the next event will be on antimicrobial resistance in November. So thank you all very much, and we look forward to continue to working with you, and thank you very much for your support.